The invitation said 6 o'clock. I arrived at 5:53, the way I always do, because my father raised me to believe that being on time is the most basic form of respect you can offer another person. I stood outside the venue, the Fairmont Chateau Laurier, which is exactly the kind of place Donovan had always wanted to impress people in, and I smoothed the front of my dress, champagne silk. I'd bought it myself, 3 weeks before, at a little boutique on Spark Street. The saleswoman had said it made me look like someone who knew exactly who she was. I'd laughed at the time. I didn't laugh now. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock, it doesn't clear its throat or wait for you to sit down. It just walks up behind you in a room full of flowers and candlelight and string quartet music, and it puts its hands around your throat so gently that for a moment you think it's an embrace. Donovan and I had been together for 4 years. We'd met at a fundraiser for the Ottawa Hospital Foundation. The kind of event where everyone is performing a version of themselves they hope will be remembered. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, which I now understand simply means he'd had a great deal of practice. He called me the following Tuesday. He brought tulips the first time he came to my apartment. Not roses, he said, because roses were what men brought women they were trying to seduce. Tulips were what you brought someone you genuinely wanted to know. I kept one of those tulips pressed between the pages of a book for 2 years. I threw the book away on the drive home from the Fairmont, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I walked into that ballroom at 5:53 on a Friday evening in March, and within 4 minutes, I understood everything. The tables were arranged around a small elevated platform, the kind venues use for speeches, for award presentations, for moments that are meant to be witnessed. Donovan was standing on it. He was wearing the charcoal suit I'd helped him pick out at Holt Renfrew last autumn. His hair was combed back the way he only did it for photographs. He was laughing at something, the way people laugh when they want a room to watch them being happy. And beside him, holding his arm with both hands, wearing a cream-colored wrap dress I recognized because I had been with her when she bought it, was Trisha. Trisha Bowman, my closest friend for 11 years. She wasn't looking at me, neither was he. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time, though I suspect it was only a few seconds, and I watched the two of them receive the congratulations of 40 or 50 people who had apparently been invited here tonight to celebrate the fact that Donovan had asked Trisha to marry him. That was the email I had received 11 days ago. Donovan and I have something to tell you. Dinner, Friday, the Fairmont? Very excited. Tea? Very excited. I had assumed it was a promotion. Trisha had been up for a senior position at the federal ministry where she worked, and she'd been anxious about it for months. I had brought her chamomile tea the night before her review panel. I had sat on her kitchen floor with her while she ran through her presentation out loud. I had told her she was brilliant because she was, and that she deserved every good thing because I believed it. I believe a great many things about people that turn out not to be true. Here is what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not walk across the ballroom toward them. I did not pull Tricia aside and ask her to explain herself, or look at Donovan until his practiced smile faltered, or say a single word to anyone in that room. I turned around. I walked back through the lobby, past the concierge desk and the heavy brass doors, and out into the cold Ottawa night. I stood on Wellington Street with the canal somewhere behind me, and the Parliament buildings lit up gold across the road, and I took 3 long, slow breaths, the way my father had taught me to do before any important meeting. Then I got into my car. I drove to the Glebe, to the townhouse I'd lived in for 6 years, and I made myself a cup of tea. English breakfast, not chamomile. I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought very clearly about what came next. My name is not what I used to be. I mean that in every sense. Before I came to Ottawa, before I met Donovan or Tricia or any of the people who populate the last 4 years of my life, I was Margot Belair. I still am Margot Belair. But for 4 years I had introduced myself as Margot Hale, using my mother's maiden name because my father had asked me to, and because I had understood why. My father is Gerard Belair. If you follow Canadian business news, you know that name. If you don't, I'll tell you this. When the Globe and Mail runs a profile on him, the headline usually involves a word like Titan or Empire. He built Belair Capital from a 2-person office in Montreal in the 1980s into one of the largest private equity firms in the country. He owns stakes in infrastructure projects from Halifax to Prince George. He sits on 3 national boards and 1 international one. He is quiet, precise, and completely without sentimentality in any business context, which is why people underestimate how much he loves his children. He has two, my brother Remy and me. I moved to Ottawa because I wanted to. I had completed my MBA at Rotman, turned down 2 offers in Toronto, and chosen to work for a small urban planning consultancy on Bank Street because the work interested me and because I wanted, genuinely, to build something that felt like my own life rather than a continuation of my father's. He understood. He always has. The condition, if you could even call it that, it felt more like a gift, was that I go by Hale, not to hide from anything shameful, but because he had watched what happened to other wealthy families when their children moved through the world trailing their inheritance behind them like a price tag. The wrong people came close, the right people stayed away. Nothing was ever quite real. I had wanted real. I had chosen real. I had been so certain that what I found was real. I sat with my tea, and I looked at my kitchen wall, where there was a photograph of Trisha and me at Mooney's Bay, the summer before last. She had her arm around my shoulder. We were both squinting into the sun, laughing at something I can no longer remember. I'd framed it myself and put it there because it made me happy every morning when I came downstairs. I took it down that night. I set it face down on the counter, and then I called my father. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does. I told him what had happened. Not all of it at once. I found I needed to pause several times, not from grief but from a kind of breathless fury I was trying very carefully to manage. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his great skills. When I finished, there was a silence. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," I said. "I'm angry." "Good," he said. "Angry is useful. Hurt just sits there." He asked me one more question before we got off the phone. And I want you to understand that this question was asked very quietly, without any drama, the way you'd ask someone if they'd like a cup of coffee. He said, "Do you want me to do anything, or do you want to handle this yourself?" I said I wanted to handle it myself. He said, "Then I'll stay out of it." "But Margot, don't rush." I didn't rush. The first thing I needed to understand was how long it had been going on, not because the length of the betrayal changed the nature of it, but because I needed to know how much of my own history to revise. How many dinners, how many evenings, how many moments I had experienced as ordinary and private had actually been something else entirely. The answer, as it turned out, was 14 months. I discovered this gradually, the way you piece together a story from fragments. A receipt I found in the pocket of a jacket Donovan had left at my place and asked me to dry clean. A text message I saw for 2 seconds on his screen before he tilted the phone away. A series of small, nearly invisible inconsistencies in his Friday evening explanations that I had filed away at the time because I'd trusted him and had no framework for what I was actually looking at. 14 months. Trisha had sat across from me at my kitchen table, drinking wine and talking about her anxiety about the review panel while sleeping with my partner for over a year. I want you to understand something clearly. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I don't enjoy conflict. I was raised to solve problems methodically, to look for the exit that causes the least collateral damage, to keep my voice even. But there is a difference between vengeance and accountability. There is a difference between causing pain and removing a hand that is still actively in your pocket. I gave myself 2 weeks to be a person who was simply sad. Then I got to work. I started with Donovan, because Donovan was the simpler problem. He worked in commercial real estate, development side, for a mid-sized firm called Theron Group. He'd been there 6 years and was angling for a partnership. His entire professional identity was built on relationships, with developers, with city planners, with the municipal contacts who could smooth or complicate a rezoning application. Ottawa's commercial real estate world is not large. Everyone who matters knows everyone who matters. That kind of ecosystem runs on reputation the way a car runs on fuel. I had been in urban planning consultancy for 5 years. I knew those same people, not because of my father, because of my work. Because I had been good at my job and had shown up for a long time and had never given anyone a reason to doubt my word. I did not spread rumors. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. I did not go to anyone and say Donovan Marsh is a liar or be careful of Donovan Marsh or anything that would be recognizable as a campaign against him. What I did was much simpler. I stopped vouching for him. Over the previous 3 years, I had casually mentioned Donovan's name in a dozen professional conversations. Donovan knows that building well. Donovan worked on the Wellington project. Donovan Marsh from Theron, he's sharp, small endorsements. The kind that accumulate quietly and become, over time, a kind of soft infrastructure of professional credibility. I stopped, and in a few cases, when his name came up, I said nothing at all, which in a room full of people who read professional silence like a language said everything. Within about 6 weeks, I heard from a colleague that a developer, Theron, was courting. A Vancouver firm looking at an Ottawa project had decided to work with a different firm. The contact at the Vancouver firm was someone I'd met at an Urban Land Institute event in Toronto 2 years earlier. We had stayed in touch. I had not said a word to her about Donovan, but she had asked around about Theron, and what she'd found when she got to Donovan's name was a certain careful quiet from people she respected. That was enough for her. Trisha was harder, not harder to address, harder emotionally, because she represented something I hadn't fully admitted to myself until I lost it. She had been, for 11 years, the person I called when something good happened, and when something fell apart. She had been at my mother's funeral. She had sat with me in the hospital waiting room the night my brother was in a car accident outside Kingston. She had known, actually known, the kind of things that you can only know about someone you have accompanied through time. And she had looked at all of that and made the choice she made anyway. The professional piece with Trisha was more straightforward than it sounds. She worked in federal policy, which means she worked in a world where everything is about access. Access to decision makers, to information, to the rooms where things get decided before they're announced. She had spent years building her network carefully. I had, as it happened, several connections to that world. Not through Belair Capital, through my own work, through years of navigating the intersection between municipal planning, environmental assessment, and federal policy on infrastructure projects. I had been on 2 advisory panels. I knew people. What I did was this. I became very busy. I accepted every invitation I had been declining politely for 2 years, because Donovan had preferred weekends at his cottage in Lanark County, and I had accommodated that preference. I went to receptions. I had coffee with people I should have had coffee with a long time ago. I let my own profile, which I had kept deliberately modest, become slightly more visible. The natural consequence of my becoming slightly more visible was that certain people who had assumed I was a pleasant but peripheral figure in their world began to understand that I was not. And in discovering what I actually was, they naturally began to wonder why Trisha Bowman, who they had always assumed was connected, had apparently never thought to mention it. Credibility is a strange thing. It doesn't require action to damage. Sometimes all it requires is for the right people to ask a simple question and receive an uncertain answer. By the time spring arrived, Trisha had been quietly passed over for a position she had been told was essentially hers. I heard this from someone who had no reason to be cautious. They described it as a puzzling decision. I agreed it was puzzling. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to say that clearly. What I felt was something colder and more final, like a door closing. Like a chapter of your life going quiet. In April, Donovan called me for the first time since the night at the Fairmont. He'd clearly heard things. He wasn't angry, he was careful, which was worse, because it meant he knew he'd done something that put him at a disadvantage. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. I said, of course not. He said he hadn't handled things well and he knew that. I said, people rarely do. He said he thought Trish and he were good together, actually, and he hoped eventually we could all. I said, Donovan, I want you to know something and I'd like you to really hear it. I kept my voice the way my father keeps his, level, almost warm. I don't have hard feelings, but I need you to understand that I don't have soft ones either. We're done. That's not anger, it's just accurate. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, who are you? And I said, I'm Margot Belair. The silence that followed was the most satisfying moment of that entire 6 months. He knew the name. Of course he did. He worked in commercial real estate development in Ottawa, and Belair Capital had a stake in 2 major projects in the National Capital Region. He had probably seen the name in documents. He had possibly sat across a boardroom table from someone who reported to my father. He had never, in 4 years of sleeping next to me, made the connection, because I had never given him a reason to look for it. In that silence, I could feel him recalculating, going back over 4 years the way I had gone back over them. Revising. You never told me, he said finally. No, I said. Why? Because I wanted to know what you were without it. I paused. Now I do. I hung up. I'd like to tell you that was the end of it, that everything resolved cleanly and I moved on without residue. That's not quite how it works. The months that followed were sometimes genuinely hard. I missed Trisha in a way that wasn't about anger, just absence. The specific grief of losing someone who used to understand your references. I had to learn to call different people when things happened. I had to revise my address book and my roster of trusted opinions, and the list of people who would show up if I asked. But there were other things too. I started spending more time on the work I'd been putting off. I had been managing, for 2 years, a potential collaboration between my consultancy and a federal infrastructure initiative. Something I'd been circling carefully because Donovan had been skeptical of how much time it would take, and I had, without fully admitting it, been letting his skepticism shape my ambition. I stopped doing that. I called the project lead on a Tuesday morning in late April and said I was ready to move. The project was significant, the kind that ends up as a case study. We were working on a corridor redesign for a mid-sized city in northern Ontario, Sudbury specifically, integrating sustainable transit infrastructure with existing residential development in a way that required unusual coordination between municipal, provincial, and federal partners. My firm had the right expertise. I had the right relationships. It came together faster than it had any reason to, and it was, if I'm being direct about it, the best work I'd done in my career. My father came to Ottawa in June. We had dinner at a restaurant on Elgin Street, just the two of us, and he listened to me talk about the Sudbury project for half an hour. He asked smart questions. He ordered the wine carefully, the way he always does. At the end of dinner, he said, "You seem like yourself again." I said, "I think I'm more myself than I was." He considered that. Then he nodded, very slightly, the way he does when he's genuinely satisfied. "That," he said, "is the only thing I was ever worried about." I walked home that night through the glebe. It was a warm evening, the kind of June night in Ottawa that almost makes you forget what February feels like, which is maybe the whole point of June. The tulip trees on my street were blooming. I had a key in my pocket to a home I had built for myself. I had work that mattered and was mine. I had a name I had finally stopped hiding. It occurred to me, walking under those trees, that for 4 years I had believed I was protecting something by being careful. By keeping my name quiet, my inheritance invisible, my real self, just slightly out of reach, and in a way I was right. But there is a version of careful that tips, over time, into absence. A version of self-protection that quietly becomes self-erasure. I thought about Donovan saying, "Who are you?" in that careful, recalculating voice. I thought about how long he'd had to ask that question. 4 years. Every morning. And never had. The question he thought was an accusation was actually a confession. He had never been curious enough to find out. That is the thing about people who underestimate you. They're not doing it to you. They're doing it to themselves. They're choosing a smaller version of the story because a smaller version is all they're capable of holding. You can be furious about that, and I was, for a long time. Or you can recognize it for what it is. Information about who they are and who you no longer need them to be. I kept my name after that. Belair. I put it on my office door. I used it at conferences. I stopped managing other people's assumptions about it and let them arrive at their own understanding in their own time. Some people were surprised. A few were embarrassed, in that particular Ottawa way, where embarrassment comes out as sudden overcordiality. Most people, honestly, just updated their mental file and moved on. Remy called me the first week I started using the name publicly. He's younger than me by 3 years and dramatically less patient, which has always been his chief characteristic, and also, I think, his great strength. He said, "Finally, I've been waiting for you to stop playing small." I told him I hadn't been playing small. I'd been playing strategically. He laughed and said, "Margot, those aren't always different things." He might be right. I've been thinking about it. What I know is this. I came to Ottawa 6 years ago wanting something real. I found real work, real friends, a real neighborhood, real winter mornings, with real frost, on the windows of my townhouse. I also found, somewhere along the way, a person I had loved genuinely and a friendship I had trusted completely, and both of those things turned out to have been performances by people who knew how to look real without being it. That is not a failure of my judgment. I want to say that to anyone who has been where I was that night in the lobby of the Fairmont, turning around in their champagne silk dress and walking back out into the cold. It is not a failure of your judgment. Caring about people, the way you actually mean, it is never the mistake. The mistake belongs entirely to the people who met your sincerity and chose to use it. I went back to the Fairmont, once, about a year later. There was a reception for the infrastructure project, a small gathering to mark the formal federal commitment to funding, the kind of event that gets a 4-sentence mention in the Ottawa Citizen. I wore something dark green that I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I drank sparkling water because I was driving back to Sudbury the following morning for a site walkthrough. Trisha was there. I hadn't known she would be, but it didn't surprise me. The room was not large, and there was a moment where our paths were going to cross or not, and I decided they would, because I was done arranging my movements around the edges of her choices. We stood 3 feet apart by the windows overlooking the river. She said, "Margot." I said, "Trisha." She looked like she had several things ready to say and had decided against all of them. I understood that. I had done the same thing, many times, in the year since March. I had written things in notebooks and deleted texts and stood in my kitchen at 11 at night rehearsing conversations I never had. I let her stand there with her unsaid things. Then I said, very quietly, not unkindly, "I hope you're well." And I meant it. Not warmly. But I meant it. Then I turned and went to find the project lead, who wanted to introduce me to someone from the provincial ministry, and I spent the next 40 minutes talking about transit infrastructure in Northern Ontario, which is, genuinely, one of the things I find most interesting in the world. I drove home late that night with the radio low and the highway dark, and the trees coming in close on either side the way they do when you're heading north. I thought about the tulip my 28-year-old self had pressed between the pages of a book. I thought about the saleswoman who told me champagne and silk, made me look like someone who knew exactly who she was. I thought, she wasn't wrong. She was just early. I am 36 years old. I live in a townhouse in the Glebe, with 2 very opinionated houseplants, and a reading chair I've had since graduate school. I have a project in Sudbury, and a name on my office door, and a father who answers on the second ring. I have a brother who tells me the truth in exactly the way I need it, and sometimes in ways I don't, but that's what brothers are for. I have, finally, the specific kind of quiet that isn't absence. The kind that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never really listening. Some nights I sit in that reading chair with a book and the lamp on, and the Glebe is quiet outside, and I think, this is it. This is the real thing. Not because it's easy or full or complete in the way that stories are supposed to be, but because it's mine. Completely, exactly, undeniably mine. And no one will take it from me again.